Today is our final of a three-part series where we've been in conversation with small town and rural faith leaders. And today it is awesome to be joined by Susan and Craig. Um, I'm sorry, Susan and Doug today, because what I have discovered in this process is I'm at heart a fan of storytelling. I had no idea the level of storytelling that it takes to be able to connect people to one another in quite the way that I did until I met Susan and Doug. They are just doing such great, amazing things through not only the stories you're going to hear today, but the invitation they have given to congregations all across Maine and sharing their stories. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, Doug, for joining us today. I wonder if you can unmute yourself, if you're able to share a little bit about how you find your soul today.
How's your soul today, Susie?
That sounds like a place to start. We're very happy to be with you. We find that the experience of sharing stories is something that is never the same twice. And we find that as we've been welcomed and participated with different churches, there's no such thing as a story that just stays the same, that we are all living our lives with God's help and finding our way forward and have things to teach each other and celebrate with each other also about the gift of what it means to be church.
Well, I'm going to answer that in a slightly different way, which is that my soul is thankfully doing pretty well today. I went on an early walk in search of the moose, which has been appearing on our rural Maine road in recent days. Yes, a moose. They allow us to live in their neighborhood, and in the process, I happened to meet a neighbor who was on her way to radiation therapy, and every time she goes by and we stop and we chat, and we had a nice, very, very good chat. And I listened to the birds singing early this morning, the chickadees and the warblers, and life abounds. And so I feel blessed and graced to have been on that walk and to be with all of you. What a delight. We have people from so many parts of the country. And I know we have dear friends from Canada. So
Yeah, look at this. We've got Allentown, the Penn Southeast Conference, New Hampshire, Trevorton, Wisconsin, near Quakertown in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. We have folks in Wisconsin and Hershey. Hi, Hershey. I grew up near Hershey. We have Ohio. We have oh, I'm going to mispronounce that. We have another Wisconsin person. We have some folks from Houston. We have, oh, look, California, Montreal. Look at all of this. Coral Springs, Florida. Everywhere. I love it. And
or
thank you
encantado,
both.
whatever we should say. Yeah.
There you go. There you go. I love it too that, Susan, you tapped into the soul of a story, right? What nurtures your soul is hearing a story and perhaps it not staying stagnant. Like it doesn't have to be the only story we tell ourselves. I love that. And then Doug, I live in the Southwest. And so our version of the moose is javelina. And so they definitely don't want us. They appreciate us though, because they get to eat all the trash out of our trash cans, but nonetheless, yeah, life does abound near us and around us, despite what's happening in the world. And so, I got a chance to meet you through this wonderful group of people called the STAR Coalition. That's the Small Town and Rural Coalition. And Susan, when you weren't there, it was Doug, and Doug is like, yeah, I kind of wrote a book about small churches. I was like, you did what? You wait, what? I want to hear. And so I got a chance to meet with him. He introduced me to you, and I got to hear a little bit about what it meant to write a book about small churches. And so I'm curious. I know it seems like it should be obvious, but can you tell us the title of the book and how you came up with it?
Well, the title of our book is The Little One Shall Lead. And here's a look for you at it. Um, and the concept behind that is that small churches find their way and lead us forward. And I think we have been really excited about the fact that small churches have important ways not only of living their faith, but important ways of helping us all live our faith. It's not just helpful for other small churches, it's helpful for large churches as well. The one thing that I've been saying sort of at the beginning of this sort of study is that no longer is the way to be church in ways that matter the age-old big white church on the town green. That we have lived into this world, into our time in history in many different ways. And as we've done that, the way we practice our faith has changed. And the ways and small churches don't have any one way of living their faith. They have many ways and many stories, which we're looking forward to telling. But they have a lot to teach churches of every size. So that this, while you think about it as being a book about small churches, is really a storytelling intended to help churches of every size.
Yes, indeed. And so what you're saying is that, a little one, a small one, a little one isn't necessarily the size of your church, is what I hear you saying. It's so much bigger than that and broader than that.
There's a narrative at our time that possibly small churches, I don't know, are an aberration. They're not real churches. Perhaps I'm extending that a little bit. I don't want to overemphasize that, but I think perhaps it's a question of what's the future of small churches. And what we have found is that the president of the churches who we have visited is it's full of promise and vibrancy and spirit and commitment and so they have something to lead, if you will, or teach anyone who would like to look at the possibilities for how a church might be a church in our time and the times that are unfolding before us.
Yeah, and I love that. And for those of you are viewing us today, I get the advantage of being with our tech team and our presenters, about a half hour before the webinar starts, and we get to be in conversation. And I had to disappear off a camera for a little bit to find better internet here at the church. Yeah, and I got to hear the back conversation, and Susan and Doug were talking about, well, here's a story about how this church decided to move beyond its church building and so on and so forth. And you're right, there are so many ways for us to be the church. But I am curious, as more people continue to tell us where they're coming in from. We have Minnesota, New Hampshire, Alabama, Uganda, Kansas, Massachusetts, Virginia, South Dakota, Iowa. I love it, love it, love it. Welcome. Did you notice, or let me take a step back. I'm curious about how you wanted to become engaged in this work. Maybe sharing a bit about your process, about how you got to know the churches. How did you engage them? What was your methodology? How did you get them to trust you, right? Because I do know that, sometimes when you're interested in learning about a church, they're excited, but then also a little weary of people coming in and wanting to learn about them in the way perhaps that y'all were. So I'm just curious, can you share a bit about your process, and then what made you even interested in wanting to help share the stories?
Well, I think we have different stories ourselves to tell you. But I would say in my case, I served as associate conference minister here in the main conference. And during those how many years? During those 8 to 10 years, I visited churches of all sizes and really was taught so much by them about what it meant to be church, and meant that was very special. And then when I retired, I tried to follow all the rules of the UCC and stay away from churches and stay out and just keep my distance. And I waited until the annual meeting a year later to go back and visit and, see people and hear what was going on. And I went in and I ended up going over to a luncheon table. And most everyone was already sitting down and having lunch, but there were just a couple of seats left at one of the tables. And so I sat down there, and strangely, uniquely enough, either you were already there or you came in right after. Doug ended up sitting next to me. And as we started to talk, the first thing that came to mind that we were excited about were things that were going on in small churches. And that was not with the idea we're writing a book or anything like that. It just was something that had touched us that we were excited about and wanted to share. So that is where it started. And that led us to visiting churches. And we spent a number of years on this, 6 or 7 years, something like that. It took after a while, we said, we should write these stories down. They're so good. But that wasn't the plan day one. The plan day one was we were so excited to share what we had experienced with each other.
My story about gathering stories, I visited a church one day. It's called the New Sharon Church in Maine, small church. They had gone from having a settled pastor to a very part-time pastor, quarter-time, and found that was not something that they could afford. Their numbers were around 10, 11 people. So I knew some of these people. I'd known the previous pastors, and I just went to worship one day. And so I come into the church, and there are about 10 people sitting around a table. It's kind of the table, like a church supper-sized table. And there's a candle in the middle. There's a stack of Bibles, a stack of hymnals. Somebody's handing out the order of worship. And so they're sitting in a circle. And I thought, well, okay, I kind of noticing and like this. And when it came time for the scriptures to be read, one of the people who was the leader for the day said, who would like to read the Psalms? Who would like to read the Hebrew scriptures? Who would like to read the epistle? Who would like to read the gospel? It hadn't been figured out ahead of time. And so somebody, I'll do it, I'll do it, I'll do it, I'll do it. And some people had brought their own Bibles and read out of that translation. Some people took a Bible off the table and read out of that translation. And then they said, so now let's talk about how the scripture touches us. Went around, everybody had a turn. Nobody said, no, I don't have anything to say. Everybody spoke. And then when it came time for the prayers of the people, sometimes called the gathering of joys and concerns, prayer requests, there was a candle at each setting. Each person would light a candle and say what they wanted to say. And what people said could be the well-being of someone in their family or someone who was part of the church, but it was just as well somebody else in the community or people on the other side of the world who were going through a natural disaster or in a war zone or whatever was happening, so that their joys and concerns were universal. And every single person had time. There was no rush to this. There was no rush. Not like we've got to get through this because we have to get on to the next part of the service. No. All the time in the world that each person needed was there for them. And some people they spoke a second time. And I came away from that just really astounded in a good way. This is beautiful. Look at this participation. What pastor wouldn't want to have everyone comment on how the scripture touched each person? I will say that I went back and so I thought, well, what's going on here? I mean, this is like, house churches 2,000 years ago. I got that part, but now, and so I started asking some questions, talked to some people at the conference, and I said, this is really fascinating. So, well, it's another church. If you're really interested in this, is another church you might want to take a look at. And so I called them up, and it was what we call a warm handoff. You know what I mean? A warm handoff is when it's not like a completely cold call, but I say, hi, I'm Doug. I live over in Farmington, and I'm very much interested in small churches that are doing some really creative things. And so this person suggested that I might call you, and so I'm just wondering if I could come and visit, and we could talk. And so they said, sure.
So what I'm hearing you say, both of you, is that you were curious
Yes.
and that you were welcomed into that curious state with other people who were also curious.
Yes.
Yeah,
I think
I know it.
they were curious. They were curious about us. We were curious about them. We're all kind of being curious together. So
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to, it sounds like a simple question, right? Oh, so you were curious. They were curious. It all worked out in the end. But I think that where we were finding ourselves is, I look at some of the things that people put into chat. There's a lot of like negative connotations that are happening around the narrative of small churches, of, what do we need to grow the church, seems to be, what do you need? You need young people, you need this, you need that, or whatever. But really, I think where it starts is that you need curiosity, right? Because curiosity is an opportunity for us to open up the possibilities of so many things, and maybe even offering up the possibility of these congregations, these churches, wanting to boast about who they are and what they do, is what I've heard you say. What do is that what you found when you were working with these churches?
Well, I think when you tell a church's, when you were invited to visit a church, and then when you start discovering their story, that it's a very meaningful story and you want to share it because it matters. And that's in many ways both being grateful to that church and asking their permission, may I share this? And the stories don't stay the same forever. I'm wondering if I can tell a story about a church.
I think you should.
Okay, I'd like to tell you a story about the Winslow Church. And there are two sort of stories here. One is like 10 years ago, and one is more like 5 years ago. But 10 years ago, they called a pastor who needed to serve the church 3/4 time. Her husband lived in Washington, D.C., and she would go back to see him 1 week a month. And so when you have a situation that comes to a church, the question is to them, how are we going to make this happen? And what ended up happening was that the membership of the church took over leading Sunday morning worship once a month, and they all took turns and worked with it. And they also had the clergy in town would help cover for her as pastoral care was needed. So there was something that happened that how's the church adjusting to the fact that they now have a 3/4 time pastor? There's not a book that says this is what you do. They lived into it as faithful people, and that's what they did. And in time, when their pastor left the church and they began a search, which I was still with them when they did that search, the one thing that they asked was, would it be all right if could they please, no matter who they called, could they please continue to lead worship for themselves once a month? It had become a very meaningful process. Now, that same church have that story, but they were living their faith. And how do you go forward? It's not something that's stagnant, it changes. And they thought that they would like to learn about what it would mean to have a food pantry. So they contacted the local Catholic church that ran a food pantry and asked if they could come visit. Well, the local Catholic church said, sure, come up on this day. And they got all set to come, and they got a phone call the night before saying, we're very sorry, but COVID has hit our church, and we are not going to be able to continue to be a food pantry. So basically, their plan went awry, and they just wanted to go and see a little bit. They didn't want to jump into something or do anything too quickly. So they went back to their church, and the pastor got a phone call that night from
Good Shepherd.
thank you, from the Good Shepherd Food Bank, which is this huge food bank supplier for all over Maine. In fact, one of the biggest food bank suppliers in the country. And they were asked, would they be willing to accept a delivery of food, which was going to be immense? And they had about half an hour to make this decision. So they talked among themselves, and as a small church, were able to make a quick decision. And they said yes. And people arrived the next morning and emptied out rooms in this little house next door to the church. The local stores, Home Depot and Lowe's and all of that, gave them gave them metal shelving and everything. People started coming to help do whatever they could. And Boy Scout troops came over, people who were away from school because of the COVID thing came. Everyone was jumping in and helping in any way they could. And they began running one of the largest food banks second largest?
It's the second largest food pantry in Maine now. It serves multiple counties.
Wow.
But not only that, and that was a quick, nimble decision. And little churches can be more nimble than big churches. It would take many committees, and what are we going to do? And we can't meet about this. We're sorry. They just said yes. And the Boy Scout troops that came to help, they came back and used that church as a meeting place. And the Brownie troops did the same. And people came to know them in so many different ways. And that's just a case of the 3/4 time clergy situation was one, but they were living their faith walking forward. And something they never expected happened, and it's still unfolding. But that's where one of the things we have learned is the churches don't have one story, and they live forward, and things evolve, and they don't stay the same. There you go.
Yeah. Oh, I love it.
Just another way of approaching your question is that about the concerns of churches for how do we grow, how do we attract more children. We can talk about that. However, those are not the questions that we found those churches were asking. And in fact, one of the discoveries was that they're not looking in the rearview mirror. They're not looking at regaining
What used
to be. They are asking themselves, who's here now, and how can we be a church with who is here now? And doing that has gained them. There are some new people who have come and been attracted to that. I'm not talking about going back to 1960 in terms of numbers, but I'm talking about they're not looking back. Maybe at one point, I'm sure, at some point in their longer story, they ask those questions. Those are completely understandable questions, but they're not asking them anymore. They're asking, how can we be with who is here and the gifts that people have? What is our sense of call? To what are we called? And let's focus on that. And
discover that. You don't have the answers.
That really runs through essentially every congregation that we visited. Their story now. It's not the story back when they were found. I mean, it's not that doesn't matter. It's important. Of course, that's important. I mean, very brave and courageous and faithful people founded these churches and brought them through over the years. But the question they're asking us now is now. We're now the church now.
And that brings an interesting contradiction, I think. How is it that you were able to invite these congregations, these churches, to share the stories of who they are, and then also see that's because so many churches, and I hesitate to continue the question because so many churches, when I'm out, tell me about who you are. Tell me they will return to the features, you know, like that they had done. Oh, back then we used to do this and we did this and we did this. And we're like, great, who are you now? Well, this is who we are now, and we're dying and we're done and we're whatever. So, in the process of asking these congregations to share their stories with you, did you find that you had to like provide encouragement for them to realize that, oh, wow, you're doing really magical stuff now? You know, what did their stories enlighten for them and you?
I think that we helped them to discover their stories. They didn't know what
Mm,
it was. We didn't say, "What's your story?" and they'd come out with it. But having the chance to worship with them, to meet with them as a congregation afterwards, to return, not just to walk in and get a story and walk out, but to get acquainted and really value them as brothers and sisters in faith. They those were times of discovery. Our
mm.
book, half the stories, people wouldn't have really thought about that's my story until we, with them, not for them, but with them, lived our faith.
A pretty common response to our being there and saying we're here to learn about your story. We did say your story now. They would say, "What story now?"
What's your story now?
That's how we worded it. People would say, "Well, you know, we haven't really thought of ourselves as having a story. We didn't really even think as though we're doing something that's all that special. We're just doing what we think is the right thing to do." It's just, I mean, it's as simple as that. If you're gonna, it's not unlike, I don't want to overemphasize the comparison, but like, but pastoral care, start talking with somebody and invite them to tell their story. Well, if I said, "Tell me your story," they might respond to that, but just get a conversation going and be a listener and follow their lead, and the story comes out. And so there's a story. And I think that's, we really did experience that. And people also said that I think it's good for us to be thinking about this in this way, that we do have it. We know what we've done. We know what we're doing. We know it matters to us. We hadn't really thought of it as a story, but we see that it is.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so they made those the same way as if, I don't know, we have a conversation and your story comes out and I say, "That's quite a story." And you might say, "Well, gosh, I never even thought of it like that before." But yes.
But discovering those stories was not in any way with the concept that here's the story and this is what you all need to learn.
Mhm.
Everyone's story was different. And so it wasn't, I just was saying that it's not something that everyone else has to agree with. It's each group had their own version of how they wanted to live their faith. Yeah.
Definitely. Definitely. Go ahead.
I think the question about willingness to share their story, openness, that's a very good question. And I'd have to go back and ask the people that. But it's my first kind of impulse for that is that in small communities, people are used to sharing and
That's
helping
true.
each other out. And I would say
That's true.
the prayer life that you're telling me about, or I'm seeing, and the role of the laity, and how you create a choir out of no choir, or just these things. What I'm seeing, these expressions of faith, I think that other people could benefit from from hearing about this. And people said, "Well, sure, of course, go ahead." Again, well, we didn't think it was all, we just doing what we thought again.
Tell the story about the choir.
Oh, the choir. This is the wonderful. So this is Brooks, Maine, Brooks Church. They're maybe 2 dozen people, maybe 30 on a well-attended, well, just large, that'd be a large attendance. And they had a choir, and their choir director moved away, and so there's no one to lead the choir. So no choir. So then I was told by the current choir director, she'd been in the choir, and she just stood up one Sunday, "We got to have a choir. I've never led a choir. Don't know how to lead a choir. We need a choir." So anybody who wants to reform the choir, meet me after church, and we'll have a choir. Well, so you got some people. So
From beyond the church.
but then they had an idea. Well, how about inviting people from the community to sing in the choir? No strings attached. So they invited people from the community. There was a local singing group or two, and said, any folks want to come and rehearse and sing on Sunday? No strings attached. We're not expecting you to join the church, or just would you like to sing? And that happened. And guess what? Some of those people from the community who sang and in the choir for the very first time in their lives were in that church and experienced their worship, and some of them joined church. The purpose was not for that to happen, but it happened. But even if it didn't happen, even if those numbers of people didn't join the church, still what was happening was to reach into the community and invite members of the community to join the church in providing music.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful story. And there are other examples. Another church, a Broadway church, where they just didn't have enough church musicians or didn't have someone to play the piano or the organ. Went into the schools. I mean, schools are teaching music. Any the kids, high school kids want to come and do the music. Sure.
They're
So
still playing violin
they still do.
beautifully for them, and it's fabulous music.
I met a couple of young women in their 20s last summer when I went back to worship there, and they said, "Oh yeah, we've been doing this for 10 years. We love this." And so they're reaching out into the community, and that, I mean, that's a whole other dimension of these stories, is the relationship with the community. But it's well, we can't be a church because we don't have a choir. Or whatever.
Right.
But no, let's
but there's a choir.
But part of it is discovering and not apologizing for who you really are. And I'm going to quickly tell a story about the York Beach Church. And this is a church that forever had done huge potluck suppers all across the summer tourist season. And that's how they really financed their needs. And they were in trouble this particular year because they really needed to rebuild their furnace, rebuild it or replace it, and they didn't know what to do. But in that month coming up to before the dinners were to start, they realized that they were, if I dare say it, they were too old to try to do a big potluck dinner. Their way of getting around was no longer viable for them. And they felt sort of bad about that, and they didn't know what they were going to do. And they had always had a nice relationship, as I think we were just talking about, with their community. And their community knew that they were, struggling a little bit and weren't sure how they were going to do financially. And it was at that point that a summer person who was a musician, a very well-known, I can't remember who it was, but a well-known musician, offered to put on a concert for them one Saturday night instead of this big potluck supper. So the potluck stayed in the basement, and they had a fabulous concert. The church was jammed. They earned enough money in that evening to repair their furnace. And I came the next morning to preach to them. And I got there, and this woman came up to me and she said, "Dear, you need to understand, I was here last night until 10:30. That has never happened." But they were so excited about what happened, and they evolved. But it was, who are we as a church? Who are we as a community? And how do we live into those changes? And it was marvelous. And
it sounds to me like you both so whenever I hear furnace in church, I immediately go to The Preacher's Wife with Whitney Houston and the very comical furnace, chugging along and then just blowing and the kids running out and everything. That's where my mind went with that. But what I hear you saying is really not only how these folks, through the telling of their stories, through you being curious, that they were able to learn how to do church, whatever it required for them at that moment. And it was a model on how these churches can actually move beyond the church's doors to do things. It's like a lot of, what does it mean to be church, right? So we often ask ourselves, is church in the building on Sundays alone? Is church, the Bible studies, the relationships, the meals? Is church, oh, actually, yeah, that's part of it, but we also run a food bank, have a closet for our transgender siblings, have an opportunity to go and do prayer meetings with those who are living unhoused, provide sanctuary to those who are migrating here. There's so many ways that we all know that we can be the church, but I think what you've demonstrated in your book and through the stories that you've had, that you've shared with us today, is how to actually engage in the community in new ways, maybe recognizing, like, yeah, going to the community for choir members is a really good idea, because there are young folks, there are older folks, there are people who don't have an outlet to express their art, to be able to have a space to do that within a church with no expectation other than let's just mutually come together for this, is really, really special. And I think that is a model, as somebody who's the minister for congregational and community engagement, how to do one part of it is exactly what you have said. And so it is that process of going in with that listening ear. Somebody put into chat, they said, that it sounds like what you all were able to do is to, like, give folks, to help them reframe their existence in positive terms. You gave them permission to think about their situation, and then knowing that it's okay to change, it's okay to do something differently. I'm finding, is that kind of what you found when you were out meeting with people? Was there something that surprised you? Was it something that, I think you both shared a little bit of what just your presence helped noticing what it was that they were already doing has done, but what surprised you the most, I think?
Well, there's a lot there. And
Yes.
so let me try this. First of all, small is good. They're fine. Here we are again.
Yep.
We're not looking back. Here we are here now. Who's here? And let's go. What do we need to do to make this work? And I was it's not we were not consultants. We simply went to gather a story which we had been told by somebody in the warm handoff. This is a church that's being creative, and there's a vibrancy here. You might want to go and become familiar with them. So we don't take, I think I can speak, we don't take any credit for anything that they are doing. We went and we listened to their story. We honored their stories. I'm expect probably that the fact that they were recognized and honored provided some encouragement to maybe do more of the same, but we were not consultants. We were gathering their stories, honoring their stories in the process. So, the book is their stories. We wrote them down, and we exchanged that to see that we were, that it made sense to them. But in a sense, they wrote the book, or they composed it, and we put it in writing. Yes, let's work at that, but it's their story. The surprises, the high level of lay engagement, and when I spoke to you about people with limited mobility or not much opportunity to get out of the house, and they're all doing something. The Waterville Church has a prayer gathering on Zoom hosted by a layperson every single day of the week, other than Sunday when that happens in worship. Every single day, a layperson does it. Does that seem like a difficult? Does that seem like? I'm of course very much impressed by that. I've attended many of them. What happens? You check in. How are you today? Well, if it's Monday and you're not doing all that well, you don't have to wait till Sunday to bring it up if you would bring it up anyway. So you can, it's on Monday. How are you doing? And then what joys or concerns would you like to bring forth? And that's that's the agenda. And people would, sometimes the pastor would join it, but always a layperson led it. And and I'm just thoroughly, I don't know if the word is surprised, but just so much struck by that kind of lay involvement. And they're not any different from anybody else. They're just they're just they're beautiful people, like all human beings. But they're making these kinds of things work, especially if it's a part-time pastor or no settled pastor. So if it's going to happen, then
Can I tell one more Brooks story?
of course, yeah.
In keeping with that, Brooks was a church that Doug spent a lot of time with, as did I when I was working with the conference. And in their town, there was a restaurant up there that I can't remember whether they were closing or changing what sort of restaurant they were, but they had a lot of pots and different things for making big meals for everybody. And they gave it to the church because the church didn't have that and they didn't need it anymore. So they have a church which have a lot of cooking pots and pans and things. And that just sat there and that was fun. But it's like what I'm looking toward now is church discovering who they are. And the church was next door to a general store that had a very good clientele for walking in the morning and getting a cup of coffee or a breakfast sandwich and then people getting on with their lives. But the church then closed for 2 months one winter.
The restaurant closed. The store closed.
The restaurant closed, but the store, yes, thank you. The store closed and the owner went down to Florida or someplace south. And suddenly the church decided to offer breakfast on Sunday mornings. And so people started coming there to their fellowship hall, not into the church building, but to their fellowship hall for breakfast. And loved it. But it was a combination of looking at, we were given pots and pans. The store next door closed for the winter. What can we do? And that brought a whole new group of people in, some of whom chose to go to church, some of whom really added an important element of the community that then led to the evolution of a thrift shop and all kinds of things. But it's like trying to figure out, who are we? What do we have? We're a church, was just given all these cooking materials. The breakfast place next door says closed for 2 months. That's where we are. What do we do with it? And they tried and did well.
I love that. Real quick, Doug, before you go in, I would invite all of our viewers to go ahead and share a Q&A into the Q&A feature, which is a dialogue bubble with a question mark. We do have one. We'll get to that. And if for some reason you process things differently and you have a question that comes up well after this webinar, or let's say you watch it 2 or 3 times, whatever it is, if you have a question for our presenters and our guests today, you're more than welcome to send those questions to me. I'm the one who sent the email. Well, I'm not the one. Our tech team is the one who sent you the email on behalf of me to remind you of today's webinar. You're more than welcome to share your question with me, and I will forward it on to them. Go ahead, Doug. Sorry.
Well, each one of these churches is attuned to, or made a point of being attuned to, the suffering in their local community. And so the specific types of community ministries that the churches would engage in would be different, but they were committed to being a church for the community. That was a consistent method. So it is that in Aroostook County, which is our northernmost and one of our most lightly settled counties east of the Mississippi River, that the Holton Congregational Church started a support group for people of a sexual identity, sexual orientation, gender identity support group. Nothing like that had ever existed before. And so they did it in conjunction with a local hospital. They got a room in the hospital to do this. So you get kind of a neutral saying, didn't even have to come to the church. Over time, that has evolved, and that there are a couple of churches now working together on it. And instead of being just one evening a week, which was certainly remarkable, wonderful way to start. And now there's more going on many days in a week. So there was that. For other churches, some of our most remote communities, it's a 5 or 6 hour round trip to a medical center. So someone is sick there and their family members there. How do you get there? There's no bus. So they would drive people. Or again, the food, the visiting, conducting worship services in nursing homes and boarding homes, done by lay people often. So what's broken? Where's the suffering? Who's in need, and how can we match up whatever our gifts are to address that? I mean, it's very heartening. I'm humbled and touched by witnessing this.
And before I get, it is a gift. It is. Before I get to the question in chat, are you writing a second book about why lay-led leadership is important? Because you should. Because I've heard each of you share about how just quote unquote regular old folks have stepped up to be able to notice the brokenness or the need or the potential for collaboration and celebration in the community and offered to bring it into the church. They weren't relying on a pastor, somebody with an ordination and a ministerial status through the United Church of Christ. They saw it and they stepped up for it. So a second book coming.
Thank you for the encouragement. I certainly a couple of things very much need to be said. Is that the majority of these churches did not have settled pastors, but clearly the pastors were very, very supportive of engaging the people in this way, of sharing. There was a sense of mutuality in sharing a load. So it's not. So I certainly want to give great credit to every single one of the pastors involved.
And church and ministry committees were also helpful, and other teaching along the side by other pastors. There was a lot of support that came.
Yeah.
Well, that's good to hear. I know a lot of member discernments don't always agree with that, but I love it. I love it. Well, the question in the chat was, do you think there's a difference between small and rural churches and other small churches? Small churches are everywhere now, rural, suburban, urban, not, yeah. So do you think there's a difference between small and rural churches and just other small churches?
Go.
I think, curiously enough, and this is an impression, I think that inner city neighborhoods and rural and remote churches may have something in common because they have a very strong sense of their community. Yeah. So the community might be a building, a neighborhood, a few blocks, a section of a city, but a very strong sense of identity and wanting to be helpful to one another, regardless of all other kinds of things, regardless of, there are all kinds of things that we will label people and divide people up. In a small community, when somebody is hurting, when a fire chief in Andover, Maine was seriously injured in an automobile accident, wasn't a member of the church said, let's do a service here, a gathering to raise funds here. And people in different denominations helping, the Episcopal Church in Eastport, Maine says, you don't have a pastor, I'll be happy to cover your pastoral care while you whatever you need to do. So there is that sense. And so I think, I don't want to draw those kind of lines. But I will say, I think when there's a strong sense of community, which there can be in, any setting, maybe suburban, I have less experience with that. I have some inner city and I have some small town rural. So I think there are many possibilities.
Yeah. We live in Maine, but I totally agree with what Doug is saying. It's the sense of community is key. Whether it's 5 people sitting around a table or whether it's a street you live on in a city. It says,
Yeah.
I must include this quote. This little church in Eastport, Maine, which is the name implies, about as far east and north as you can get on the edge of the water with Canada. The young woman, incidentally, they chose the moderator of their church is the youngest person in the church. Young woman who this is my guess is perhaps late 30s, early 40s. Is the moderator. And she said to me, you know, we used to go to church. Now we are the church. And she
Oh,
said, I love this way of worshiping.
yes.
And
Amen.
this is a church where they sit around in a circle
Yeah.
and discuss the scriptures and take turns reading them. Credit to Weekly Seeds from the United Church of Christ, because they do refer to that. They find that as a helpful reference, but very similar to the church I mentioned at the very beginning. Sit in a circle, talk about how what scriptures mean to them, their prayer, 5 or 6 people. By the way, one person attending on a cell phone. I mean, we didn't even get to that media piece. They could go on for 15 minutes
Yeah.
or more
Yeah.
for prayer
Yeah.
because that's what they needed to do. And what's the rush?
I love that. I love that. Where do people get your book? How do they find it?
we don't know.
Pilgrim Press.
Yes.
Pilgrim Press.
We hope.
Oh,
Right? Is
yes,
that
yes. No,
yes.
I mean,
That's the way you do it, as far as I know.
There you go.
I know of people who have ordered it and it has arrived. I think it was available for purchase after June 1st. And so, here we are, we're 12 days later and
It's new.
It
yeah,
is new.
yeah, it's
Yes.
brand new.
Yes, brand new. So I heard you talk a lot about community, curiosity, listening, um, questioning, observing, saying yes today. I wonder, is there anything that I missed in asking you, or anything that you think our viewers would benefit from hearing?
In approaching the churches, we had a small number of questions, which we presented to them. And one of them was, what is dear and precious to you about this church?
About your church.
Because they're there. They're showing up. We said, what's dear and precious to you? Let's talk about it. And we encourage them to talk about it among themselves in our absence. And then we had frequently, we would have a discussion at some point in a series of visits. We wouldn't do that on the first visit, but just getting to know people and they're getting to know us. But we asked that, and then we asked, what gifts do you see in the people in the congregation? And then we asked, to what do you see yourselves called? And and we said, we're giving you these questions and use them whatever way you wish and talk amongst each other. So we didn't walk in and say, well, tell us your story. We gave them, we'd say we're gathering the stories, but I think that helped them. They also taught us, which is that, I mean, I'm going in, I want to know what you're doing. I mean, that's kind of a mindset, but from the get-go, a number of churches, they said, we want you to understand that we love each other, care about each other very, very much, and we care about the community, and that's why we are here. We're trying to figure out that's why we're here. They wanted us to know that right away.
Yeah.
But we also, I think, help them discover, as they heard each other say, this is who we are, this is what means something to me. I think that was affirming for them. We didn't come to tell them how you should be or to define who they were. We let them do that and do that in the short run, but then as they lived into it. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. And I want to thank everybody who really took time to type into chat today. Like you shared your thoughts, your opinions. There were many stories, and just so you know, our Doug and Susan will be able to get a copy of the chat for themselves to see that so many of you shared the story of your church, your congregation, your experience in the chat. And what a gift that is to have not only Doug and Susan here to be with us today, but for you all that are viewing to want to get that storytelling fever and want to share what it is that you are excited about your congregation. Susan, Doug, I want to thank you. I wish that we had more time today to be able to talk a little bit more about before we go, I wanna say thank you for taking the time. We could have talked way, way, way more. Somebody just asked real quick before I go, can you repeat the 3 questions you asked?
What is dear and precious to you about the church? I've often used it with a congregation. What's dear and precious to you about this congregation / church? What gifts do you see in the people who are here? And to what or to whom are you called? Also, variously, how do you respond to the call of Jesus Christ to serve?
Oh, I love it. I want to thank the pastors. I want to thank the lay leaders. I want to thank the congregation. I want to thank the community. I want to thank you, Susan and Doug, for saying yes and just being curious and saying yes to God's call, whatever it is, at whatever time it is. And I am just grateful to, like I said, I could have been in this conversation for a lot longer with you. I'm glad I got to spend Tuesday with you and then last week with you. And I can't wait to see you. Hopefully you'll be at Synod. If you had a question that was not answered by for any reason at all, please send me an email. I will be sure to connect you to each other. Thank you for joining us today. And I want to invite you all to come back. We have one more webinar before we break for the summer. We're only breaking this summer only because of General Synod. But we have a really important webinar coming up on Monday, June 23rd at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time for an Into the Deep, our banned book project. We'll have a chance to learn more about our General Synod Service project this year, focusing on creating banned book libraries in Kansas City and across the wider church. We'll dive deeper into why banned book libraries matter and how to participate in this year's service project and how to create your own banned book library. So even if you are attending or not attending Synod, there is still a way for you to provide to our service project. We will be joined by some of our other national ministry staff, and I look forward to being a participant in that webinar and listening. Susan, Doug, please stay in touch. Keep us up to date with what it is that you're working on, especially that second book around lay-led ministry. Just kidding. But I can't wait to be in community with you. I am grateful for all of the things that you've done to envision a world where people's stories are heard and valued and shared. I want to thank you, and I want to turn it over to you for the final word. Would you like to take us out in a benediction?
Sure. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord walk with you as you find your way forward through that and through all that you will discover. May it to be a time of blessing. Amen.
Amen.
Siblings in Christ, if you are moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.